Hello, everyone. I'm Dean Kelley with the Georgia Transparency Coalition. I'm here today somewhere in Walker County with Colton Moore. Colton is currently our House District 1 rep. He's been down there for 2 years, and he has made the decision to actually run for a Senate seat, District 53, that's currently held by Jeff Mullis. So that's throwing an interesting dynamic into Northwest Georgia politics. Colton, thank you for coming.
Hey, I appreciate you having me. Absolutely.
For those in the county and in the district that don't know who you are, won't you just give us a background about who is Colton Moore?
Yeah, so I tell a lot of folks quite humorously, I'm an auctioneer by trade. So auctioneers and politicians, we just talk fast and take people's money. But I work auctions across the globe, sell heavy equipment, so bulldozers, cranes, excavators. Don't better he but I'm hitting it down. What do you pay? Don't better he but I'm bid to. That's kind of what it sounds like. So I'm just the guy who talks fast. When I'm not doing that, I am the District 1 state representative. So that is all of Dade County and the western part of Walker County. And I had challenged the then incumbent John Deffenbaugh for that seat, and spent about $4,600 against his $60,000 war chest, and was able to pull out a win there. I essentially campaigned on a pretty simple message, and that was to get government out of our way. I mean, too often there's, especially in state politics, it's hard to find a check, right? We commonly hear about the checks and balances when we're in high school government class, but the legislature has kind of just let the governor kind of have their way for a long time now. And ultimately, there's Georgia, while we claim to have a balanced budget amendment, that's not necessarily the case. Right. We do borrow a lot of money, and ultimately, teachers, even to the point teachers are very, very regulated. So the way I look at it is, in politics, if you look at an eagle, right, there's one wing that is the very conservative wing. It's the conservation wing. It wants to conserve everything. And the other wing is like a problem-solving wing, and it wants to solve everyone's problems. So to be a good legislator, one has to kind of be in the middle, right? You have to solve folks' problems, but in my opinion, you also have to conserve our resources as a government. And I didn't feel that Mr. Deffenbaugh was really doing that. And not to mention, there were a lot of concerns that we were having in our district, and those weren't being addressed. So, I mean, we could talk an hour about those concerns, but ultimately, I was able to win. I found that once I got down to the Capitol and tried to push an agenda, that agenda was commonly roadblocked. And my senator really wasn't helping me to accomplish those goals, and that's what led me to run for this office.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go into detail. I know that was from conversations you and I have had, that was a tough decision for you to make. It's something you've thought about for quite some time. So what ultimately led you to make the decision to run for the 53rd?
So I would say ultimately that decision was made at the gun rally at Armurchie High School. This would be, I guess, a week and a half ago now. Senator Mullis had gotten up and he had given a speech, and he had taken this shotgun and he had waved it around and said, "I'll never, ever, ever take away your gun rights." And people started heckling. And they said, "What about House Bill 2? What about constitutional carry?" And we're talking over 100 people here in the room. And Senator Mullis then quickly left, and I came in and gave a speech and had to pause on 2 different occasions because of the round of applause. And I realized at that moment, if I don't take the opportunity and challenge this person, that I'm doing a great disservice, not only to District 1, but to all of Northwest Georgia.
Okay. Mr. What is Jeff doing down there that he needs to be, or not doing, that he needs to be replaced?
So, I mean, that's a long laundry list. I think one of the first things that come to mind is the fact that District 1 in a decade hasn't been able to pass any piece of legislation other than adding one member to the Department of Public Safety Board. Which, I mean, great. Maybe the Department of Public Safety needs an extra board member, but we've got a lot more pressing issues than just that, right? And all of District 1 is not only represented by me, but also by the senator. So, you know, there was a bill, House Bill 179, that I proposed and got a lot of support for. And essentially what it did was eliminate discipline reporting from the CCRPI, which essentially is a report card that every school gets that parents can look at and see kind of how the school ranks, right? It looks at attendance, it looks at graduation rates, test scores, and discipline reporting. And this is a regulation that's come about our school systems just in the last few years. And the result of it, one of those unintended consequences of legislation that commonly happens, is that teachers want to discipline a student. They send them to the principal's office, but the principal doesn't want to make their school look bad. So they're not going to mark that down. So that student gets sent back to the teacher. Obviously, all the other students in the classroom realize no discipline is going to get done, and it's very difficult for that teacher to maintain a standard of discipline in the classroom. This is a very serious issue, in my opinion. I mean, we see school shootings. We see a society that is changing drastically with our younger generation. And this is a very simple piece of legislation. All it does is mark out that one line in CCRPI. I went to the Department of Education. I had them run a statistical analysis on what would happen to all of these reports if we remove that. The A schools and B schools kind of remain the same in high school and middle school. But in elementary schools, the report cards went nuts, right? Like D schools were becoming A schools were becoming B schools, which shows that there's probably some false reporting or something going on there. I had the chairman of education, receive over 100 emails from different teachers in our area and across the state, asking for at least a hearing on this piece of legislation. This is a piece of legislation that came from about 15 or 20 different educators that I spoke to in Walker and Dade County. Did I get any response from my senator? No, absolutely not. And it became the point, I endorsed Brian Kemp early on in the gubernatorial election, and the senator sends me a text message and says, as a pre-freshman, I would advise you not to get involved in gubernatorial politics. And I say, listen, with all due respect, Senator, I'm going to endorse Kemp, you endorse Cagle. But it's just that control type politics that I don't have time, and certainly the citizens don't have time to put up with at this point. So that's what's pushed me into running for this position.
Also, too, of course, I know there's a controversy with Speaker Ralston in the abuse of legislative leave that you were involved in. One of a handful of legislators that called for the speaker to resign. Right.
No, and I got a lot of criticism off of that. I mean, a brief example of what that was David Ralston is a Speaker of the House. And he is also an attorney that works for himself, and he lives in a small Appalachian community similar to ours. And ultimately, a legislator who is an attorney, if they have a client who is to go to trial, if they have legislative business, they can delay that case because ultimately their role as a member of the Republic is more important than say this one case. There was a clear abuse of power when, and this all came to be, or got brought to light when there was a 14-year-old rape victim who at 19 years old had become terminally ill, and the accused had never been to trial. And he had hired David Ralston as his attorney, and they just kept delaying the case. And this girl was terminally ill, right? We would hope that she would have justice. The AJC did an investigation and found hundreds of cases. There was a former FBI agent, Derek Somerville, who has spoke at the Georgia Transparency Coalition meeting before, and he found 1,000 case delays. Now, people say, well, the speaker didn't break the law. Well, no, he didn't break the law, but what he did was a clear abuse of power because he was the only person in Georgia government who would have that power. As the Speaker of the House, he can claim all 365 days as a legislative duty. There was one guy in his area who had gotten a DUI, and he said, I hired David Ralston because I know my case is never going to go to trial.
Never go to trial.
Right. So, with that clear abuse of power, there were 10 of us, and there were a few more. There was actually 11 to begin with, but that intimidation politics took their names away from that resolution. But we asked him to resign or step down as Speaker. Ultimately, we were not successful, but the good thing that came out of that was the heartbeat bill wasn't going to get a hearing. He had suggested early on in that session that we weren't going to take on controversial legislation because he was worried we were going to lose, as Republicans, we were going to lose the House, and this going into the redistricting year of 2020, obviously that's a very important, that affects the next 10 years. But he realized there was a mutiny, and he decided to push that through. So, states like South Carolina, Tennessee, supposed to be very conservative states, they were not able to pass that legislation, but being really one of the most progressive states in the union, considering Atlanta, we were still able to pass that. So I think that was quite an accomplishment, and it would not have been possible, I don't believe, had a few of us really took a bold step and challenged the power that be.
That was an incredibly gutsy thing to do in Georgia, especially with all the power that the Speaker has.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, if you can save one life from this, then
absolutely,
it's well worth it.
Well worth it. Let's say you become our next senator. You replace Jeff Mullis, and he's been in office for 20 years, I guess.
Yeah.
What are going to be your priorities? What do you see is the issues that you want to take on right away?
So priority number one, first and foremost, is film tax credits. A complete repeal. Completely removing their ability to transfer these credits. And if the film industry cannot maintain itself after 10 years of subsidies, then let them go. People say, well, is that really the biggest issue that's going on right now? And I would say absolutely, because right now, all of the other states in this booming economy, well, it's a booming economy, I guess, until this coronavirus showed up. But other states are starting to invest in other areas in their state. But Georgia is kind of forced to take a haircut all across, right? The governor proposed a 4% cut. Why is Georgia having to take a cut all of a sudden? Well, if you look at the film tax credits and the other credits that we offer other businesses, and that credit part is really a fallacy. It's not actually a credit in the sense that, when I talk to a lot of folks, they say, well, a tax credit may be a lower tax rate for someone. But in reality, in the film industry, this is something that the film industry can say, hey, we spent $1 million on a film. They get 30% of that back in tax credit. Okay, so they can take that tax credit and they can then sell it to you. When you buy that tax credit, that money then goes to Hollywood instead of going to the Department of Revenue and showing up in our state budget. So right now, just this year, we don't really know too, because that's another part of this very hidden and very dark world of tax credits, is that these tax credits can show up any time within 6 years. So right now, this year alone, we're looking at anywhere from $850 million to $1.5 billion that is not going to be realized in our budget, because ultimately that money is a direct wealth transfer out of our state and into the hands of Hollywood. Imagine all the things we could do if we had, $1 billion extra in our budget. Well, if you look at $1.5 billion, that's roughly 3% of our budget. Mm-hmm. So as we're taking a cut, we don't necessarily have a spending problem now as much as we have an income problem. So that's going to be priority number one. Absolutely.
Well, what else? What else is going to be your main issues? So
other issues along the lines of bringing a more conservative voice to the Senate. The American Conservative Union ranked me as the 7th most conservative legislator of the 236 legislators. And what a lot of folks, everybody claims to be very, very conservative. and we talk about that, like I said earlier, that conservation wing. But every piece of legislation that goes through there is very likely to be growing the scope of government and getting beyond government's means. The problem is you've got 200 lobbyists standing outside that room offering to take legislators out to a nice steak dinner, or we donated to your campaign or what have you. We'll make an exception this one time and this one time. That's something I wish I could have accomplished more of when I was in the House, but hopefully I can do that in the Senate. My voting record, I voted no second most of 180 legislators. People say, well, all you're going to do is just go down there and object to everything. Well, that was only 30% of the time I voted no. But those were on the issues where, you take a piece of legislation, you got to ask the question, is this growing government? Is this necessary? Is it ethical? And currently, I don't think our senator asks those questions before he votes or pushes a piece of legislation through.
You've been down there for 2 years. What is the most frustrating thing for you as a young legislator down there at the Capitol?
You had the young part there.
Maybe I should have said legislator, period.
Okay.
Or a new legislator.
Yeah, I think the young part's really an advantage. When you're a young person and you show up on a committee meeting and the chairman recognizes you to ask a question, everyone on that committee really perks up and says, wait, who is this young person amongst all of these elders, right? And how did they get to this point? So I think your voice is certainly carried a little further as a young person. And I think there are a lot of older legislators who simply look at a younger generation and they say, oh no, they're too far gone. They're just going to be a bunch of progressive liberals. Well, my goodness, look at this young person here, right? So I think they're very supportive and they certainly listen to you as a young person. So I think that's an advantage. I think the frustration is which I guess it's a challenge one can work through, is that the Georgia House of Representatives is probably one of the most challenging chambers to operate in the entire country.
That's what I've been told by several legislators.
And that's for a number of reasons. I guess first is it's, I think, the third largest of all the states in terms of members. And also the fact that we have a very tyrannical speaker. And we see this across most of the southern states, and I'm not sure where this came from, but most of your southern states, they don't have term limits on a speaker. So once a speaker gets into office, they can kind of maintain that power for a long time. Whereas your western states like Colorado and Utah, a speaker can only last, say 2 terms. So the other challenge is because it's so big, it's also very diverse. And I mean, we have Jewish members, Vietnamese members, a large group of black legislators, women legislators, and that spectrum, you can really see a spectrum of politics in that chamber, right? I mean, we have very, very far left, like AOC type legislators, and we have very far right legislators that would probably resemble like a Thomas Massey of Kentucky. So figuring out how to build a coalition amongst all of those and push a piece of legislation becomes quite a challenge, especially when you have such an authoritarian like speaker. Also, the decorum of the House is quite a challenge because the way the House rules are written, if a piece of legislation comes up and say crossover day, just this last Thursday, I mean, we're voting on a piece of legislation almost every 5 minutes. I mean, it's literally raining down legislation as we're sitting there. And you're taking that piece of legislation, you're trying to read through it, you're trying to understand it, but in order to go up to the well and to debate and to speak about that piece of legislation, you have to sign up almost immediately. You have to run to the speaker and say, hey, I want to speak against this bill or for this bill, almost immediately when it comes up. Now, it's very difficult to do that when you have, say, 50 pieces of legislation on the calendar and the speaker at any point can pick any of those. So it's very hard to be prepared as to what's about to come up. Whereas when you go to the Senate, The Senate has a lot more decorum. The lieutenant governor schedules which piece of legislation is coming through as it comes out of the Rules Committee, so you know exactly what you're going to be debating on. It works at a little slower pace. So when it comes to changing policy in the chamber, it's probably a lot easier than in the Senate.
Gotcha. I could talk with Colton Moore all evening. There's plenty that we could talk about and discuss for hours, but that's going to do it for this segment. Hopefully we'll be able to do it again soon and continue this conversation. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from Colton in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you.